questions in the chat box while they're talking. And then once Aditi calls on you, you can unmute yourself and ask your question to the speaker directly. But please do keep leaving questions in the chat box. Great. Let me then move on to introduce our speakers. Like I said, very, very excited to introduce Dr. Alice Evans. Alice is a senior lecturer in international development at King's College London. She's writing a global history of gender. And you can read her extremely interesting blog at www.draliceevans.com/blog. You can also follow her on Twitter, where there's always some extremely interesting dialogues and conversations going on. Aditi, also equally inspiring, is India Director at the Development Data Lab. She's interested in all things gender, social norms, and economic opportunity in South Asia. And once again, thanks both of you for taking time out today. I know this is going to be very exciting. And so without further delay, I'm just going to hand it over to you, Aditi.
Right. Thank you, everyone, for your time today. I can generally think of no better way to start my Friday morning, or if I were in India, Friday evening, than a conversation with our collective intellectual hero, as we can all agree, Dr. Alice Evans. There's going to be... It's true. It's true. And then, so there's talking to Alice, but also talking about the determinants and implications of persistent patriarchy, which is a topic so important to all of us, because ultimately it does affect our lives, right? I wanted to launch our conversation by quoting one of my favorite blogs by Alice, the one on female friendships, where you write, "Patriarchy persists, men still shirk housework, governments underinvest in childcare, campus fraternities protect rapists, and male-dominated firms promote less competent men. But thanks to development and rising female employment, women now have more allies at work. Female friendships are gaining strength and emboldening each other to take on the patriarchy." I read that last bit and thought immediately of the women in econ and policy community. What else is this community if not a network of allies, right? So thank you to all of you for creating the space and this platform. Alice, thank you for being here, for your words, your work, and your time today. Now, we all know you're currently working on a masterpiece of a book, The Great Gender Divergence, which we will talk a lot about today. But before we get into all of your work on gender, economic development, growth, the labor movements, which I've learned recently that you've done a lot of work on, before we get into all of that, let's start with how you got here. Alice, who were your early influences that contributed to how you think about the world today as an economist, researcher, teacher, and individual? I've stolen this first question style from the Amit Verma podcast. I just want to put that out there.
Okay, wait a second. Because I think there are two separate questions there. One question is there something about my personal experiences that has biased my analysis of the data? And there I want to say no. I think that if any single person looks at the empirical evidence, they should come to exactly the same conclusion. And so I should be guided by their standards, no matter my personal experience. That said, is there something about my idiosyncratic personal experiences that has made it that I have launched this project? Yes, probably. So, for example, I'm the daughter of a working woman, and universally we know they tend to be more likely to be focused on their careers, etc., more ambitious. So that's one, a global predictor. Two, my undergraduate degree was in philosophy, and that really taught me to question every assumption, overturn every prior, and demand rigorous analysis. And I think third, crucially important, is that I've spent 3 years doing ethnographic work in Morocco, in Cambodia, in Vietnam, in Zambia, in Gambia, and it's by listening to people, understanding their lives, that has helped me, and comparing the differences between those communities helps me realize things that were overlooked in the literature and that I need to pay more attention to. So I think those three things, right? A strong, independent mother, logical rigor in my education, and then actually seeing and experiencing the world for myself.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. What did your mother used to do? What was her trade?
So my father abandoned us totally when I was about 11. He never paid for anything. And my mother at the time, she was not that serious about her career. She was, often working 4 days a week. But then she was like, but I've got to look after these two kids, so I really better get my act together. And so she really worked very seriously, and she became this senior partner in a law firm doing mergers and acquisitions, financing massive public investments and private investments. And I didn't know at the time really that this was quite unusual to be a female partner like that. And she would travel the world, sometimes taking us with her. So we'd go into Madrid, and my brother and I accidentally went into Madrid's red light district traveling with her. But it taught me the importance of self-reliance, believing that anything is possible. You just have to put your mind to it, not relying on anyone, and not being overwhelmed by big challenges. Now, that's not to say that I didn't get intimidated and overwhelmed. Like when I started this, or when I approach any new continent that I don't know about, I'm always like, how on earth am I going to understand the entirety of South Asian history? Or how on earth am I going to understand? So I always get a little bit overwhelmed, but you get used to it with practice.
Yeah. So, I mean, everything makes a lot of sense now, given that you obviously have a boss lady in your childhood history. And then, of course, your grounding in philosophy that helps you ask big, interesting questions and, everything that you've learned from your career as an ethnographer. So your research has asked these big, important questions that we honestly still don't have very clear answers to, such as why are some societies more patriarchal than others? Do cities effectively erode patriarchal norms everywhere, and so on? All of your research is now potentially culminating in your magnum opus, The Great Gender Divergence. Before we get into the contents of the book, can you tell us a little bit about the conception of the book? How did the idea come to you? Why do you want to write this book?
Okay, right. So about 3 years ago, I had this ginormous intellectual awakening. I started studying economic history and the Industrial Revolution. So I started reading books on how is it that some countries became rich while others remain poor. And I absolutely love this because it requires deep understanding of each society and many aspects of those society, institutions, geography, etc. And also making that comparative analysis. And I found this engrossing, and I love the interdisciplinarity of it. But then I realized there is a hitherto question that has never been asked. Why are some countries so gender equal and others not at all? And that, to me, is the most fundamental fact about the world that we don't yet have an answer to. So I was very inspired by all those big books on how the West got rich. And I just realized that most of those books on, how the West became rich and democratic are written by men, and they're not interested in gender. And I was like, hey, wait a minute. I need to write the gender one. So that's what I'm trying to do. But importantly, I don't want it to be just me. I really hope, and this is my quest in doing the blogs and Twitter, is that I can encourage and support other people to be doing their own studies and challenging me, critiquing me, because I'm not going to do it single-handedly. I can try, I'll make a draft, I'll do my best attempts, but really I want 1,000 brilliant minds working on this. That's my hope. I have no territorial policing here. I want everyone to work it out with me.
That's amazing. That's the dream. I've been on a roll. So, growing up in India, we aren't exposed to literature such as The Second Sex, and then, the American explosive book, Feminist Mystique, or Feminism Mystique.
Yes, perfect.
So
perfect.
I've been catching up on all of that, and I'm so excited for your economic growth and like this social science kind of lens of all of this. I guess the economic lens of this kind of strand of literature. I'm so excited for it to arrive. Now, let's dive into some of the ideas that we'll read a lot about in your book, but we all love a good preview. Now, the big puzzle, we're talking about India here. The big puzzle that we've talked about in India is its negative outlier status in terms of gender equality. And you have talked about India's deep patriarchal roots as the main factor. Could you walk us through what your reasoning is about why women in India are caught in this kind of patriarchal environment that just won't budge? And are these specifically deep and sticky roots of patriarchy that we see India specific? What's going on here?
Okay, I think these are all great questions. So I think from a global historical perspective, there are three major waves that made much of the world much more patriarchal. And those all affected India in a slightly idiosyncratic way. So number one, nomadic pastoralism. And we see that especially in Rajasthan, and I'm excited for my trip to Udaipur. Two, with the Neolithic revolution, saw the emergence of inherited wealth and patrilocal clans, the emergence of lineage organizations safeguarding that wealth, cooperating with each other for defense, for security, irrigation, amid anarchy. And India saw the rise of caste 2,000 years ago. So that's a form of lineage organizations organized for defense and security. So that's also important. The third most patriarchal force in the world has been the emergence of religions, especially Islam. And of course, northern India was very much affected by that as well. So India's cultural evolution has incorporated all those major drivers. So more specifically, and I think everyone will know the things that I'm talking about, so this isn't meant to patronize or anything, but so Northwest India was repeatedly invaded over hundreds of years. Foreign invaders were raping women, selling them as sex slaves. And that encouraged in Rajasthan, especially close-knit clans, and lineage is revered as a way of motivating solidarity. So there's this wonderful art history of Rajasthan where we see that these pictures, but they're all of men. It's revering the male lineage. And that's a way of saying, put family first, you're a member of this community, invest in that. So that emergence of patrilineal clans and caste is incredibly important. So then the second aspect is that Muslim rulers practice purdah, and we have the element of prestige bias. So upwardly mobile families followed suit in order to gain prestige. So women increasingly withdrew from public life on the Ganges. They worked hard for their families in the fields, but they seldom mixed in towns. And also, that religious diversity, and this is not unique to India, but that religious diversity also motivated female seclusion because families wanted to protect their women from outsiders. And we see contemporary echoes of this with love jihad. But even 100 years ago, when I study histories of Uttar Pradesh in the early 1900s, I see there are these Hindu publicists, they evoke unsubstantiated allegations about rape and aggression and abductions. So this is all deeply historic, but it's a result of religious diversity where communities that are already concerned about purity seek to safeguard their women. So then the fourth element, which I mentioned, and this is totally a global pattern, but pastoralism. So pastoralists emerged, nomadic pastoralists emerged from the Eurasian steppe about 5,000 years ago. And usually pastoralists practice primogeniture. So it's the firstborn son inherits, leaving the younger brothers with nothing. So what they tended to do is go out in these violent gangs, and they would rape and raid their way across Eurasia. And we can see that through the genetics in that they slaughtered indigenous men and they reproduced with the women. So they empty DNA, which is the female side persists, that's all the indigenous stuff, but these waves of men came. And when they came, they institutionalized ideas of brutish masculinity, patrilineal dominance, and that happened across Eurasia, and that came in, that Indo-Aryan descent into India. So India was affected by that male biased migration too. That's part of a global trend, but of course the exact process was specifically Indian. And then caste, right? Everybody knows about the importance of caste. And maybe my analysis is slightly different of the way that caste matters for gender. So I think there are a couple of elements here. If marrying within your own jati is socially and economically imperative, then there is a very strong rationale for child marriage. And I think that's why in the 1930s, the average age of marriage for girls was about 13. And that you do that to make sure that she cannot possibly reproduce with the wrong lineage. So that is a way of reinforcing caste cooperation. And this is what I meant earlier about lineage organization, safeguarding wealth, ensuring cooperation. It's a way of maintaining those jati bonds, right? So and today, as many of the people here will have written about, when Indians need jobs, when they need support, when they need to get a license, they turn to their trusted caste networks. And people continue to derive a great deal of support from their caste networks. Added to this, we have the panchayats, these assemblies of older men who policed caste by outcasting families that dissented or girls that crossed the line. And so in that way, you have the cultural evolution of, you know, restricting women's reproductive freedoms. And of course, the upper caste derived the greatest benefits from it. And so they were the ones to make sure it was most deeply entrenched. So I think those factors, pastoralism, caste, Islam, and those male-biased migration channels are the deep roots of India's patriarchy, but it interacts with the current development process. And I don't think and I think with a slightly different economic process, you could have seen higher rates of female employment. And how do I know that? By looking, for example, at UK immigration data. In the UK, the rates of female employment amongst people who are descendants from India are just as high as among native Britons. So in India, India has a lot of Indians tend to be in the UK. They tend to be very educated. 70% of Indian women in the UK work. British Indians, they work. So that tells me that these deep roots are not set in stone. They can be radically changed with education and more labor market opportunities. The problem, as I see it in India, is twofold. And people should feel free to correct me. One is that even outside agriculture, 80% of people in cities still rely on precarious work. And that huge precarity reinforces reliance on your jati network. So people still need their kin to survive. And so that reinforces the importance of endogamous marriages, which heightens the importance of female seclusion or controlling women. Added to that is the male honor. That men's honor depends on the propriety of their female kin, and so that encourages close-knit policing. And then most importantly, as everyone knows, that India has had jobless growth. And so if you have these enormous crowds, huge crowds going for the few jobs, then the job queues are so long that women are far behind and may give up entirely.
Men are ahead of the queues.
Yes, exactly. And how do I know that's true? By looking at East Asia. East Asia had rapid economic growth, and that rampant demand for labor did two things. It wasn't just that factories wanted women, but they wanted so many women that they overcame what I call the Patrilineal Trap. So East Asia had female seclusion. In Korea, there was even this seesaw jumping game. So gangbang, that is elite Korean women, they were veiled, ideally, and they were closed off behind walls. And so girls couldn't even see the outside world. So they invented this jumping game, which is like on a seesaw. So one girl would stand here and the other girl would bounce so she could see over the wall. That's how secluded Korean women were. They invented a jumping game to see the outside world. But what happened in China, what happened in Korea, what happened in Taiwan is there was such rampant demand for labor that it wasn't just that they overcame what they call the honor income trade-off. So across the Middle East, South Asia, and East Asia, Central Asia too, men's honor is dependent on the purity, the propriety of their female kin. If there's even a rumor, if there's even a stigma, a trace of a doubt about what she was doing, who she was talking to. Like I remember when I was in Morocco, a woman told me that her brother smacked her in the face because he heard she was talking to some guy. You know, male kin policing their sisters, etc. Right? What happened? Sorry, that was a tangent. We had to go India, Morocco, China. Okay, back to China. So what happened in East Asia? What happened in East Asia is growth was so rampant that there was this massive demand for labor. And that means that even though men's honor was important, it was compensated by the high economic returns to female labor. So fathers, and it was fathers because this is a gerund patriarchy, signed the contracts for their daughters to go and work in towns. Added to that, if we think of the patrilineal trap as like a negative feedback loop. So in India, for example, if you're in a village and no girls are going out to the village, you don't want your daughter to go out because then she's less marriageable, because she's the one girl who everyone is that worried about, who she's spoken to, who is she living with, what kind of dormitory is that in. So she is uniquely unmarriageable. Whereas if growth is so demand that everyone's daughter is going to the factory, then it's no longer that she is less competitive in that marriage market. So you're overcoming that negative feedback loop. And that's precisely what happened in East Asia. They overcame that negative feedback loop and it became a normal, expected part of adolescence. So there are two elements. One is that economic returns are sufficient to overcome men's loss of honor, and also that men's honor is no longer so diminished by her going out because everyone's doing it. So it's fine, it's okay. But India, like Morocco, is now stuck in this patrilineal trap. And that's a consequence of the deep roots and also the contemporary development process.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that is a lot to take in. I mean, my biggest takeaway from what you said is, okay, there are these unique factors that, well, not unique, there are these distinct factors that have interacted and created a strong preference for female seclusion in India. But then my biggest takeaway from what you said is that if there is a different kind of economic development that creates this kind of eruption of demand for female labor, and then, you know, dads kind of sanction it, and like everyone in the marriage market is now a working woman, like that may help in turning things around. That said, I mean, you've talked about this a little bit already when you were talking about the impact of pastoralism and then the impact of the raids in the Northwest and so on. Different things have happened geographically in different parts of the country. Different communities have different norms for endogamy. Some communities are okay with intra-village marriages. Some communities, like there's different levels of endogamy that is practiced. And you have started getting into this, right? The big question, anecdotally, every time we travel is my mother asks me, you know, as you continuously go down the coast, you go to Goa, you're seeing women staffing the petrol pumps. You don't see that in Gurgaon ever. And there was your delightfully viral article on why are North India and South India so different on gender. So we've talked about India as a whole, and we've talked about how there have been certain things that have led to a divergence between, say, the East Asia example and the India example. But let's go within. Can you tell us a little bit about what you already know about the why of, let's just take North India and South India to keep it simple. Why are they so different on gender? And can you also talk about what remains unresolved for you?
Oh yeah, good question. Okay, right. So I think so Northern India. So I think, let me make one important distinction. In Rajasthan, for example, women work in the fields. They are harnessed for family labor. But when it comes to towns, which means mixing with non-kin, then female labor market participation is very low, because then there's a heightened risk of dishonoring the male lineage. So why is there? So when we talk about female labor force participation, that's what we really need to focus on, the female seclusion. And female labor force participation, and so across Uttar Pradesh, across Bihar, you see that if women are working, it tends to be in home-based enterprises that are often controlled and managed by male kin who go off to make deals with outsiders who do the bargaining. And that kind of home-based work does not advance women's autonomy, because it does not enable them to talk about what you so rightly mentioned, female friendships. So work is not the end goal. The end goal, as I see it, are female friendships, for women to get out, for women to share ideas, for women to start questioning the idea that they should be eating last or eating the leftovers, for example. That's not something you can think about or realize or feel entitled to or be emboldened to demand just by earning some money sitting at home inside. So the process of gender equality, which is slow, is about female labor force participation in the public sphere, mixing and mingling with diverse others, coming to critique and share ideas and lambast the patriarchy and take on the patriarchy. So why has that been more difficult in North India, as contrast with some of the southern cities of like Mumbai, for example, where there was this great campaign for public loos for women effectively demanding services in public spaces so they can use those public spaces, or demanding safer public transport. And in that way, creating a kind of public, a positive feedback loop, in that the more that women are in cities, the more they use that activism to make those cities safer for women, then they can feel more comfortable in using those cities, then their families will feel more comfortable. Whereas, and this is something I should have mentioned, again, in Delhi or other cities that are where streets or trains or buses are full of men, those are unsafe spaces. So that's another factor contributing to the negative feedback loop. Sorry, I should have added male luxury and sexual harassment, which massively creates family fears about male honor. So again, that's a negative feedback loop. The more that men dominate the public sphere, the more that families worry about letting their daughters to go out at certain times, etc. Sorry, right, I should be more focused. Okay, so that is just sort of setting out the story today, right? In some parts, there's this seclusion, and that creates a negative feedback loop. So what are the causes of it? One, the male bias, the Indo-Aryan migration coming from the Northwest and into the country. Now that's male biased and much more patrilineal. So that's a male biased ideology. Male bias migration, and that's based on pastoralism. And then some of those people who were pastoralists then migrated into other areas. So for example, Jats, historically pastoralists, migrated into Uttar Pradesh. So I think the migration of pastoralists, bringing that culture, very important. The second element is what I mentioned before, that Muslim rule, which was privileging female seclusion as a sign of piety and prestige bias, that was India's geography shaped the direction of Muslim rule, and that was concentrated on the Ganges, stopped going further south because of mountains, and then into the Bay of Bengal. So I think that was enormously important. And if we look at Purdah practices, it closely maps on to those ideas of pastoralism, migration movements, and Muslim rule. Previously, I emphasized rice cultivation, and I think that's important. So along India's southeast line, we tend to see higher rates of female labor force participation, and that may have been because rice was more labor intensive. But it's difficult to differentiate that from other channels. And the more I learn, the less I actually emphasize geography, and the more swayed I am by more about population movements, culture, and institutions. I've become less of a geographical determinist the more that I learn. And I also think what's really important is that even if women's labor can be marshaled in the fields, that really is no guarantee of their autonomy. Because across the world, women can work, but that work may not be recognized. And they may still be tightly policed. They may still not have the autonomy to go out and mix and mingle. So I think we need to be really careful in thinking about, there's people like Naila Kabir have shown that, working on the family farm really isn't empowering. It's just grunt work. It's just grueling grunt work. So yeah, so in summary, to answer your question, I would emphasize population movements, conquest, and pastoralism.
I think we're running out of the 30-minute slot that we gave ourselves to have our discussion. No, not at all. I did want to talk a little bit about if Indian cities are doing anything for women's work and so on, but I'll park those questions because I want to open it up first, and time permitting. We'll come back to what, if anything, has urbanization done for women's work in India. But before I open it up to the audience, I just wanted some parting thoughts from you.
Yes,
from our one-on-one time.
Yes.
What do you have to say to young, ambitious women in economics and policy? In India, where we've discussed at length that there are all of these deep roots of patriarchy, and if we're honest and we know fully well the determinants of the equilibrium, we know from your work that it will take decades to evolve. What are your thoughts for all of us, to kind of motivate us to stay on, though we know that these things take decades to evolve and like the current equilibrium isn't going to budge anytime soon.
You want the Alice
you've
Evans
experienced.
You want the Alice Evans motivational talk?
Yes, give us the quick version of the Alice Evans motivational talk, and then we'll come back to what the audience has to ask of you of women's work, and the variations within the country and so on.
Listen, this is the real Alice Evans motivational talk, and it has nothing.
We are here for it.
You ready for this? God, you brace yourselves. Okay. This is a personal story. But I think this shows the importance of drive. So if you want a story about grit and drive, this is your story. Okay. So when I was 18, sorry. When I was 16, I still hadn't had periods. So I went to the doctor and they thought, maybe she just hasn't properly finished puberty. So they gave me like the pill. They thought, give me more estrogen, give me more progesterone. Let's jack this up. It still didn't work. So they doubled the dose. So they put me on more and more hormones because they thought that would help. It didn't work. So then they put me on a patch to bypass the digestive system. It still didn't work. So then later on, I had an MRI scan, and that was inconclusive. I had another MRI scan, and what they discovered is that I was born without 4 organs. I had no uterus, I had 1 ovary, I had 1 kidney. And at that time, I was born, my vagina was just like a dimple, just nothing. So what they said, so this is a condition that affects 1 in 5,000 women. Everything else externally, chromosomes, normal. It's just missing a few internal organs. And so this affects 1 in 5,000 women. And of course, in many parts of the world, this is a total death sentence of ostracism. But what they said is you can make your own vagina. So they gave me a series of dilators. The smallest was this size. The largest was overwhelmingly scarily huge that terrified the life out of me. But I was just supposed to ram one in for like an hour every single day of sheer pain, and do that for like a year. And I remember I went to the nurse because there's this great team in London. I went to the nurse after 3 months. She was like, 2.2 centimeters. I went back 6 months later. She was like, 6 centimeters. So this was slow, painful progress. Anyway, but I did it. I made my own vagina. And then I sometimes go to talks in London where they have all these women with this condition. It's called Rokitansky, MKRH. I go to women, and there's huge social diversity of women. You know, some are in hijabs, some are in hot bands, whatever. But they're usually quite distressed and upset. They feel like they're not women. They're very upset. They feel down. You know, they've just been told like they're not properly formed. But I give this talk, and I'm like, hey, I'm Alice Evans. I made my own vagina, and you can too. And I talk about it, and I don't talk about it that much, but I'm happy to talk about it because for me, it's just a medical issue that I solved practically. So I saw the problem, I learned what I needed to do, and I set myself about it. And so that, I think, is the most upbeat talk I can give you about grit.
I don't think you could have done better. And there's just so much there. You are the chosen one to write this story. I'm sorry, like you come with the best possible qualifier of all. So thank you for sharing that, Alice.
No, my total pleasure. My total pleasure.
Yeah. Like this is what you have. Work with what you got. Do your homework, and then get into it.
Just go.
I think we have a hashtag that's come out of that story. Make your own vagina. I'm here for it. We're all here for it. All right. I'm gonna stop monopolizing Alice Evans' airtime, and let's open it up for questions. People, you can.
If anyone has any questions about the whole Rokitansky thing, I'm really not shy about it. So I can talk. You can ask me anything on the global history of gender, any country, any period, or even my own vagina. Feel free.
I love that. Okay, so if you all have questions, you can go ahead and do the little hand raising emoji thing on Zoom, and I'll try to keep an eye out. But meanwhile, or you can just unmute yourself and go for it. I think there's a question by Dhruv already. If you want to read it out, Dhruv, and meanwhile, I'll scan to see if there are some other questions.
Yeah, sure. So my question was like this: we see that there is a north-south divide in gender indicators. But lately, from this NFHS survey, we are finding that this domestic violence against women is more prevalent in southern states than in north. So
Yeah, I
my
think this
question
is
was
really
like,
important. This is hugely important. My suspicions are twofold, but I think this needs to be more investigated. Number one, in the South, there is some data suggesting higher rates of drinking, and in India, we know that if a man drinks heavily, it triples the likelihood that the woman will be abused. So I think that's a big factor. And someone could do a very clever analysis, like looking at something about liquor shops or how, number of liquor shops and how near and the rate of domestic violence. I think that's an important point. Liquor and the specific kind of liquor. Liquor is a major catalyst there. Also, we know that Indians are more likely to live with their extended families, especially like married brothers living together in the north. And that may slightly reduce gender-based violence. Whereas in nuclear families, which are a bit more common in the south, then women might be at slightly higher risk of it. So I think that's one possibility, is the household formation. The other, Vidya Mahamre and a co-author have recently talked about patriarchal backlash, and that happens more in the north, that women who do go out for employment, they're at heightened risk of domestic violence. So there could be something around transgressing norms, but I think it may be something about alcohol abuse, household formation, and possibly a backlash to women's work. But I think that's more. I think the backlash is more in the north, actually. So that's a great question, and I totally agree. And we should say also, with India's north-south divergence, that even though there is a divergence in some aspects, even though the south does better in some respects, female share of representation is very low across the country. So the south is not an outlier in that respect. But
female share of political representation?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I see. Sonal, you had your hand up. Did you want to throw out your question?
Sure. Can you hear me, Aditi?
Perfect,
yes.
Perfect.
Hi, Alice. Thank you so much. And you know that you have a great fan following, and I'm just so happy to hear you. I'm like your biggest fan on this planet. Okay, so I'll not waste your time anymore. I want to ask you is, what is the next biggest thing the government can do apart from economic growth to accelerate gender equality? For especially, what is your advice to people who work a lot with governments, Alice? Because we do see that the economic growth remains jobless. There are great gender divides everywhere. We see every aspect, and the data available is pathetic. I would say that gender disaggregated data is almost not available in India, credible data. So what is it that the public sector, especially the government, can do apart from economic growth? We know that feminist mobilization is very critical. Female friendships are critical, but what is it? Is it quota? What is it that is in the hands of the government?
Okay, I think two things could be important here. Two things that I would like to see research on and taken much more seriously is how can we make India's cities safer for women? Now, what can be done to make Delhi's transport system safer for women so that families are more comfortable and confident about women going out and about? What can be done to reduce families' anxiety that their honor could be threatened? So number one has to be how to make India safer for women. Now, the uphill challenge is that as long as a space is male dominated, there's going to be that lechery, that sexual harassment. But, okay, here's a story from Morocco. Now, in 2018, two female tourists going up Mount Toubkal were raped and beheaded. Now, the government of Morocco was extremely concerned about losing tourists because suddenly people would be scared about going to Morocco. So what did they do? They cracked down hard on, making sure that female tourists were safe and that they would be feeling comfortable to Morocco. Now, I was in Morocco for 3 weeks. not once was I sexually harassed. Not once did anyone say anything remotely inappropriate. But interestingly, I had, I spoke to many of the women, and they would say, on my walk to university, I'm harassed 4 times, or this guy is grabbing at me, or looking forward to when Ramadan is over. So the idea is that because there is this police presence making men afraid to sexually harass tourists, the white women are safe. Meanwhile, the exact same men are harassing Moroccan women. And that tells me that if the Moroccan men were afraid that they would be punished and held accountable for violence towards tourists or harassment towards terrorists. So all the state needed to do is to instill that sense that there is no culture of impunity, and that if you do this, then there'll be serious trouble. And so there were police posts in Fez, police posts in Marrakesh. So my point is that it is possible for the state to act and for people to worry that they will be held accountable. And when people think they'll be held accountable, then they are far less likely to perpetuate abuse, because sexual harassment and sexual abuse persist for the same reasons all over the world. The perpetuators see a culture of impunity. They think they will get away with it, so they continue to do it. That's not unique to India. And victims think that they won't be believed. They think they'll be blamed. What was she wearing? Where was she going? And so they don't report, and so they don't hold these people accountable. But when the state enforces accountability and makes women feel safer, they can be much more comfortable and confident. So to me, that Moroccan insight suggests that it's possible to change this. Now, add to this, I know, for example, the literature on public governance in India. Like, for example, Lamp Pritchett talks about India's flailing state, that in terms of local service delivery, there is weakness. And so there are limitations to public law and order at the local level. But to me, I think that making India safer, especially for women, must be a number one priority. And of course, in partnership with feminist groups to work out how to do that, how to make buses safer, whether that means buses for women, carriages for women, more street lighting, whatever it is, whatever is needed, that must be a priority. And of course, what's making this, and we can't forget, what's making this so much harder for Muslim women now is when Muslim communities feel under siege. When Muslim communities feel under attack, as we know after previous events, that families are more, when women feel afraid, they'll be less likely to take jobs outside Muslim ghettos, more likely to work inside the Muslim ghetto, less likely to want to traverse across another neighborhood, especially late in the evenings. So it's important for Indian women in general to feel safe, and especially for Muslim women to feel safe, because otherwise their movements will be much more heavily policed for fears of safety. So I think those elements.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Thank you, Sana.
Thank you.
And thank you for your kind words.
Thank you, Alice.
So we have a question from Pooja, whose internet is patchy at the moment. So I'll just read it out from her. And then I see 2 more hands in the chat box, so that more questions are coming. So Pooja's essentially asking about how do we think about the balance of power that is skewed towards upper castes and wealthy subsections of Indian society. And she's kind of thinking about how when families get richer, as households get wealthier, gender attitudes actually become more conservative. There's some evidence of course, we know female labor force participation drops, but then there's also evidence of son preference increasing and so on. So she's essentially asking about how do we create accountability in that powerful section of the population, and this kind of relates to accountability in terms of sexual harassment as well. We have seen way too many instances of upper caste men just kind of assuming lower caste women as property that can just be exploited at will, and there just aren't consequences for their actions. And likewise, along the income dimension, we've seen just way too many cases of that. So one is the broader question of creating accountability and thinking about these powerful sections of society where gender attitudes actually worse, and just that sidebar on how this plays out in case of sexual harassment too.
I want to say, okay, so there are two questions there. One is about the accountability, and I want to talk also about the relationship between gender equality and wealth. So I think there is a rural, as my understanding of the data, there is a rural-urban difference. So in rural areas specifically, when families become richer, backward castes and Dalits especially try to buy prestige, try to buy social respect by secluding women. So it's like they're more than they're by the force of poverty and impoverishment, bare bones survival. Yes, they have to sacrifice honor, but as soon as their circumstances get a little bit better, and that's partly as a result of the Green Revolution, then they prefer to seclude women. And that's very much a rural phenomenon. We see that more. Whereas in cities, actually, as we know from Stefan Klassen's work with Janet K. Peterson, that actually it's upper educated women, female graduates, and this is true in Bangladesh as well, female graduates are especially likely to work, especially in the South. So when there are jobs as software engineers in pharmaceuticals, they seize those jobs. Why? Because they're well paid and respectable, also because they're often going to be working alongside upper caste men, so there's less of a risk. Okay, so that's just the one point about wealth and gender equality I wanted to clarify. Yeah, I think the idea of men's impunity for raping lower caste Dalit women is horrifying, and it's not something that can be easily solved because it's a global phenomenon, right? About institutions being rigged to benefit the powerful. And people and when people dominate institutions, they perpetuate their own dominance. And I really don't have a solution for that. And it's going to be hard to change that in a culture, in a society where you have low female labor force participation in the public sphere, where women aren't mixing and mingling. They can't or struggle to make the big, bold networks that you need to mobilize in order to challenge the patriarchy. And also there's an element of a despondency trap. So if you see the police protecting their own caste, then why bother mobilizing? Why bother investing all your efforts, investing all your energies when the system is rigged against you? And so this is another element of a negative feedback loop, which I call the despondency trap. If you never see anything that gives you hope, if you never see anything that the system could be changed, and Gabby Crooks-Wisner has some nice work on this in Rajasthan, where she compares different villages. And in villages where people are consistently mobilizing to extract public goods from the state and the state provides local services, then people are much more optimistic and they keep on mobilizing. So you can get into that positive feedback loop. It's just a question of how do you get from one to the other? And for women, that really involves safer spaces and more economic growth that gets them into the public sphere, I think. So there's definitely a despondency trap that has to be tackled. And it's hard. It's really hard. And I don't have the easy solution. All I can do is explain it. That's my best effort.
It's a start. Okay, yes, so we have three more questions, Alice. How do you want to do this? Should we get all the questions?
Say them all at once, and then I'll give some grand finale.
Sounds great. Adrika, Garima, and Kanupriya, do you want to just unmute yourselves and yell out your questions in that order?
Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll switch on my camera too because I feel like it's like better to talk that way.
Perfect.
Hi. Yeah. First of all, thank you, Women in Econ and Policy. I always have a wonderful time in all sessions that you guys have conducted. Also, thank you, Professor Evans. I love your energy, and I had a really great time listening to you as well. My name is Aditi. I'm a third-year economics student. For that. My question to you is that you mentioned this phenomena that you call the Patrilineal Trap. So I was wondering if what kind of differences persist in the way that this phenomena plays out in rural and urban settings, and also what are the ways that we can do to sort of fix this thing, and if that differs in rural and urban settings too. So I hope this makes sense.
No, that's perfect. Perfect. Okay, let me answer that one quickly because I know exactly what to say. So in large, thriving cities, especially in, for example, Tamil Nadu, but also in the Northwest, we see declining caste residential segregation. So when people can secure jobs, they rely less on their jati network. And when they rely less on their jati network, they don't need to control female sexuality so much. So women can be much more responsive to those economic opportunities. So economic growth drives gender equality in two ways. One, by reducing the dependence on kinship, and second, by creating those economic opportunities, then women can go out into cities. So I think the jobs in cities, that's the powerful driver. But that's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you for answering.
All right. Garima and Kanupriya, do you want to go ahead?
Yes. Hi, Alice. This was amazing, and as always, listening to you gives me lots of thoughts. I'm just going to throw a few out there, and please feel free to pick what you want to get to. So, I completely agree with you that we need better institutions to make women feel safer, and that's perhaps the best way to get more women out there. But how do we ask for this more effectively? And there's lots of internalized constraints in the process of women getting out there and mobilizing as well. The second thing that I wonder about is how do we change so the care burden, the norms around that, and how that affects how women's lives are organized. And lastly, and maybe this is related to everything, so if everything about women's lives comes down to the male honor, and also basically the brute force that the man would exercise over the woman, how do you get out of this, and how do women find self-realization? So yeah, please feel free to attack whichever.
Okay, so let me make 2 points. I think one, it's true that women do have a large care burden, and another thing the state can do to reduce that, and they have been doing that, is piped water. It being awful, I forget the name of a paper that's come out on piped water and female labor market participation, and I can send it. Shruti interviewed him, and he's a PhD student. I'm sorry, I forget his name. Anyway, piped water, any kind of social infrastructure that reduces the volume of work, great. I'm all for it. As for the redistribution of the share done by women, I don't believe you can change it. I don't believe you can change it first. Actually, it usually happens as a cultural lag, as a consequence of labor market participation. Another thing the state could do, and this is a speculation, and I don't know, but I'd be curious to see the results, is that male majority organizations tend to be hostile to women. So we see this all over the world. Every single male majority space is hostile to women. They distrust women, they question them, they challenge them, they don't trust them, they give them menial tasks. The Indian state is also male majority, and that's something the Indian state could change with quotas. So the Indian state could give quotas for its workers. That's something easy that could be done that would make it less hostile to women. If we say that any male majority space is hostile to women, have a quota, and it would be less hostile to women. So that would be one thing. So care burdens reduce with social infrastructure, hostile sexism in the bureaucracy reduce with quotas. Those are 2 suggestions. Thank you. Great question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Garima. Anupriya, you're up next.
Hi, thank you so much for taking up my question. So my question is a little specific to what you said in your initial session where you were explaining your book and about whatever you've done in your studies. So there was this one particular line that intrigued me where you mentioned that, in Britain, because a lot of Indian origin Britishers who are living there, and they tend to work more, like women there are working more, and that is why they are less victims of patriarchy over there, right? So my question over here was fundamentally, and because you were doing a sort of a parallel comparison as compared to what India could adopt from that particular experience over there. So my question was particularly from India, because a lot of women here are also housewives, and they're housewives by choice. They want to be with their family, and there is nothing practically, I feel, wrong with it. So,
of course.
And you mentioned that a lot of women who were in UK who had who had gone for like higher education, who had gained the good amount of education, who were going out and working in the job market, and they were having labor opportunities, and that really helped them to come out of that system which was plagued with patriarchy. So for like a country like India, where a lot of women have chosen to be housewife, to be with their family, do you think education there would matter a lot for them to liberate themselves from these effects of patriarchy that been plaguing our society for a long time?
Okay, great question. Female education. Now, here is the most unfeminist thing I can say. Female education is totally overrated, because across the Middle East, it now has total gender parity. Saudi Arabia has gender parity. So here's the model that when men gained education in the 20th century, they increasingly valued female education. They wanted educated wives and daughters. And Aditi in 2 seconds will put up the papers on marriage markets and female education in Rajasthan. You all know those, right? When men want educated wives, and then female education becomes rewarded in the marriage market, and parents do it for that reason. So it's they want educated wives because they see those as good wives and mothers. That does not necessarily mean that families then want women mixing and mingling in towns, meeting with non-kin. So actually what's happened in the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia is that many women are very educated, but they're still caught in the patrilineal trap, because there's still this male concern for honor, and the stigma and suspicion that will be achieved as a result of women being in the public sphere is not offset by sufficiently high economic returns to women being in the public sphere. So female education is a necessary but not sufficient condition. It is totally overrated.
Oh, I agree. You know how in India there's the slogan "Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao." So this is the government's big slogan. It literally translates to "Save your daughters and educate your daughters," and people have bought into that. But the problem is, and there is that research showing that your daughter's not going to get a good marriage prospect if she's not at least completed at least high school education and so on. So people have bought into, you need to save your daughters and educate your daughters. And maybe they've even bought into she can have a job up until marriage, but they haven't bought into she can have a career at all. I mean, we're just so far from that. So totally with you on that one. I think we have run out of time, and I don't see questions in the chat box anymore. So I think what that means is we're maybe coming to the end of this conversation.
There's one question.
Yes.
Can I sneak one in under the wire, Aditi?
Yes. Oh, Maya. Hi, Maya. Yes, hi. Please do it.
So, Alice, thanks so much. Something I was wondering about as you were talking was the effect of migration in this context, right? So one is, of course, access to migration as a whole is much more male dominated. But then I guess there's also some research talking about effects in the village or in the home community if there is a very known seasonal pattern of male migration. So do either of these things matter? What do we know about their effect? Any thoughts?
I think women being left behind. So there is a phenomenon of women being left behind when men go out to other states. And yes, women make some decisions by themselves when men are gone. But then as soon as men come back, the same patriarchal dominance is begun, because there's been no process that would start off cultural change. They don't have economic autonomy. They haven't been exposed to new ideas in cities. I think that would be it. Yeah, so that's a good question, but I don't believe it has a major effect on gender roles. What will change things if there is, if India had strong demand for labor, then families would see it as advantageous for their daughters to go off to factories or their daughters to go off to work in cities. But that's what we're waiting for. Now, I want to say this thing because everyone has been so kind to me and so nice, and I appreciate this so much. And you totally, I really appreciate it so much, because, it's so nice to be able to talk to people and share these ideas. And what I appreciate so much is do you understand that I'm just trying to learn? You know, I'm just curious, trying to get my handle on it. And please feel free to correct me if you see me making any mistakes. Don't feel that you'll offend me. Don't feel that I know the answers, because I don't. I'm just learning like everyone else is. So I appreciate that people embracing that spirit. Now, I want to also add that I'm coming to Delhi in August, and then in November and December, I'm coming to Mumbai and Chennai. So if anyone wants to meet up, please get in touch. I would love to meet people. That would be really tremendous and fabulous. So please, yes, I just really, really appreciate how nice and kind and welcoming and supportive and helpful everyone has been. It's very, very kind. You know, it's daunting doing this project. So it's nice to have a community to be part of. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. This conversation was like therapy. It was great. Thank you for doing this. And Ahita, that's all we have for you. Do you want to? Should we close?
Yes, I think.
I'm so awkward. I don't know how to end things.
Yeah, no, I don't want to like be super formal, but just, I mean, thank you so much. Like truly, there's so much to think about after today. And I think thanks to everybody for engaging and asking so many questions. I think this has been fantastic. And like, I mean, I won't say it again, but Alice, your work is phenomenal, and just so excited for the book to come out and just to talk more about these things in the future.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Aditi. Thank you for just taking out the time and for doing this with us.
Thank you, Aditi.
Thank you. And we hope to see you in India when you're here.
Yes.
So
yes.
Very excited for that. Yes. Fantastic.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you. Have a nice weekend.